Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the second roundtable of International Political Sociology Winter School. This roundtable will discuss the topic of world politics in disarray, trends, dangers, and possibilities. I'm very happy to welcome our colleagues and good friends who will take part in this roundtable. So, to my right, Rob Walker from the University of Victoria in Canada, and Jeff Huysmans from the University of London. And to my left, Mirko Palestrino from the University of London as well. Each of them will have close to 15 minutes to say their piece, and then we'll open for questions and interventions from the public. Thank you for using a mask. Thank you. Yeah, everyone. Good. And thank you for being here on Thursday afternoon in July. Yes, good. My name is Joel Nogueira, by the way. Yeah. I coordinate here the IPS Winter School. Okay, good. We'll start with Mirko.
Thank you, John. Thank you, everybody, for being here. So I guess my starting point for this brief intervention on the theme of world politics in disarray is perhaps not so elegantly the conversation I've been having the other day with Rob and Vicky as we were having breakfast. And the three of us, we kind of agreed on the idea that world politics is perhaps normally in disarray, or that, in fact, it might thought of as being always in disarray. And it might be quite difficult to think of a world politics which is instead in array. So as I sat down to think about what I was going to say today, I thought, okay, what do we make of this? What does it mean to think or assume that world politics is in a state of disorganization and messiness, and to say that in fact it is always in such a state? And as a student of IR studying war through time and temporality, my mind went straight to time. And I guess from a temporal perspective, to say that world politics is baseline disarray, I think makes a lot of sense. Indeed, provocatively, we might even say that we would not need time as a concept in the first place if it wasn't. So time, in other words, can be thought of as one of the instruments that we use to make sense of this state of disorganization, and through which we kind of strive to bring some order to it. And so in this sense, time could be thought of as a device that enables us to trace or establish some trends, and in turn paves the way to both dangers and possibilities, as the subtitle to the roundtable suggests. So to bring some clarity, I think I want to make two arguments in this brief intervention. Firstly, I want to suggest that time and temporality, for that matter, are one way to grasp the very idea of world politics being in a state of disarray. And here I think that time is good at providing a common language to think critically about what it means to construct the present of world politics as being disorganized and messy, and perhaps to relate this idea to more or less organized pasts and futures. And secondly, I want to argue that once we understand time as an analytic for the study of world politics, then we're also better equipped to formulate critique and therefore think creatively about alternatives. So in short, time is first an analytical lens to grasp world politics, and second, a tool for critique. So an assumption that I should make clear before I start delving into this twofold argument is that I'm working with a social constructionist understanding of time, and in particular with a processual or relational ontology of time. So without getting too technical, the idea is that there's no such thing as a natural time. Rather, time is akin to a measure or something that humans come up with in the attempt to make sense of change. And so time can be defined as a human-led operation of synthesis and ordering, or a process through which different phenomena are arranged and coordinated using one of such phenomena as the standard or measure for the other or others. So think, for instance, about the clock. The numbers, the numerical interval on the clock, are one of such continua of change. And we then relate it to other things that change. And we use it as our frame of reference to understand, for instance, the unfolding of our days, right? So I woke up at 7:30, then I had breakfast at 8, then I made my way to the university at 11:30, etc., etc. Now, another example of continua of change that worked as frame of reference could be autobiography, when we time our existence. It could be, in history, stuff like planetary movements, agricultural cycles, etc., etc. Now, importantly, there are, I think, at least a couple of implications that stem from such a processual understanding of time. So first, as I said, time becomes social rather than natural, and in turn, it becomes political. So as a result, we can identify a variety of time, each of which has a distinctive politics, and we can kind of scrutinize them. So think about what we choose to leave out from our autobiographies when we recount them. That's just an example. You can do the same with the rest. And secondly, and relatedly, time, as I said, is human-led. So whether we're sponsoring a specific continuum of change to be the frame of reference for the others, or whether we're simply adopting it for convenience, like the clock, then we're contributing as actors to the reification or creation of a specific temporal regime, so to speak. And so not only we can identify the actors involved in the production and reproduction of temporal regime and think about their politics, but more interestingly, we can demystify time by tracing political agency and perhaps actively contributing to temporal regimes. So, to go back to my 2 points, and war politics in disarray. If time is what arises from this relation and processes of ordering, then we quickly realize, I believe, that to think of war politics as being in disarray, and in turn to identify trends, dangers, and possibilities, is to perform timing operations. And in particular, one way we can think about this is that we are actively constructing the present as a state of disorganization and messiness, as the word disarray suggests, so that at that point, action, and most likely ordering, is called for. So no wonder then that we can't really think of a present of war politics which is in array. To identify one, to identify a state of order and ascribe it to the temporality of the present, would, I think, possibly lead to the foreclosure of politics, as no action would be perceived as desirable or indeed needed. And order then is most likely to be found in either the past or better still in the future, perhaps even a utopian one. So the very idea of trends, dangers, and possibilities in the subtitle work quite well in this respect. As social scientists, for instance, we think it's our job to trace trends, that is to find historical patterns of global and political ordering or disordering, to evaluate them, identify danger, and perhaps learn and stay away from this danger, or identify possibilities to move towards. But all of these operations are temporal and therefore political processes, and that we establish and construct in the present. So what a temporal approach to world politics calls for is a critical attitude towards the present as the socio-political space in which both past and futures are imagined, to think about and invite action. Action which, as I said, is usually in the here and now, but basis on both the back then and the yet to come. So to reiterate my first point, I think that time works quite well as an analytic to make sense of the very idea of political disarray as an invitation to act, synthesize, and order. And in this register, then we can ask the question of the why of this operation. So here, I think time also enables critique, which is my second point. So if a relational account of time and temporality postulates operations of ordering as human-led, social, and political, then we can think about the implications of such politics of the present. So some of the questions that we can think about are who is constructing this present as disorganized and therefore inviting action? What are the politics of this representation of the present? Which interests, for instance, does this construction serve? And thinking critically about the politics of the present entails subjecting the timing operations that we identify to analysis and scrutiny. So take the idea of trends, dangers, and possibilities that I mentioned before. All three of these ideas, if you think, are quite likely to be found in political speeches from politicians across the political spectrum. Through time, however, what we can do is politicize them and inquire into the politics of the narrative being constructed. So which are the trends that are being constructed in those narratives? Which of these are identified as pasts and futures, desirable and dangerous? Is the present being constructed as a time in which to generate change and in which direction, etc., etc.? And I think we can ask this question for any timing operation that we're able to identify. So again, going back to the idea of social scientists in point one, we can pause and think, what is the politics of just, thinking that war politics is in disarray in the first place and starting from there. So I guess I'll stop here. And yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mirko. I would like to say that Professor Ritu Beach was supposed to be with us in the panel, was not able to attend the panel for reasons of health. So we regret that our dear colleague Ritu is not here with us this afternoon. So, yep.
Hi, everybody. Good. I was going to start from a similar thing that I can't think world politics without being in disarray, but that has now been done. And I think might be done again. You're going to do it too. All right. I'll do something about trends then, dangerous trends and possibilities, which is about if the world politics is always in disarray, then the question is, of course, about how is the disarray organized, rendered, and acted that is there. And I was thinking I wanted to talk about the rendition, the organization of disarray around two particular trends and make a claim around why I think there are stakes in there and see if I can connect them back to why I think the project of IPS or fracturing is so important today, politically, the politics of knowledge. So the first trend I want to talk about is how representation are in disarray. There is an element of dealing with kind of multiplicity, heterogeneity as a problem. So difference is seen as a problem. And one of the trends I see in my place, at places in the world, which is, for example, tied up with the strong articulation of an ideological politics around the far right, the re-emergence of some elements of Marxian thinking, as well as an ideological thinking, an element about splitting the world in the global north, the global south, the races between black or color and white. So you have a strong binarization of the disarray and the multiplicity that's going on. And that's a quite specific way of dealing with disarray. And what we call, therefore, it's a mode of polarization. You might know there's quite a bit written, I think, nowadays about polarization in politics and how politics polarizes. And I have a problem with that because it's a representation of that difference is a problem that needs to be solved through polarizing that is there. This is a world in disarray, but there's a highly organized way of rendering disarrayness by bipolarizing politics, which comes with a binary rendition of struggle, fight, a re-ideology, I can't pronounce this, a re-rendering of ideologies as organizing devices of totalizing worldviews, or even if they're not totalizing internally within the organization itself, organizations, but presented as such because of the binary. And I think that's a form of disarray which bothers me and worries me. First, because to me, there are interesting stakes at play about how one understands what it means to have democratic politics and democratization going on in here. There's a re-emergence of, for example, the right call upon representing and calling the people into being, and we represent the people and do it in a binary way for that. There's also an element that concerns me in the sense if you understand that democratic politics will be a politics of decentering, where you have no center of power, but only the relationship between multiplicities that are articulated. Therefore, it would be a politics that works against what you would find in people like Edelman and so on, where one actually thinks that politics is a binarization in opposition. The British parliamentary system is a very good example of how you try to binarize in it. So the question that arises, therefore, I'm not going to call it dangerous. I'm going to call it just, maybe it's a trend. We might disagree whether this is a trend, but I see the trend operating both in the way that my own academic field is being reconstituted to some extent in the recent years, as well as lots of the debates about what's going on in certain places politically, how that is done too. For me, that's a stake. It's a real stake, and it makes the stake about retaining a legitimacy of multiplicity and heterogeneity and decenteredness of relations, and how to articulate this politically in institutions that it retains that element. Because it is very seductive, if you think about world politics in disarray, to actually move and say, I have a choice here or there. And if one side homogenizes and totalizes, that the only counter move is to counter totalize to it. So you take the opposite critical position to question, for example, the rise of the far right by returning to some other form of that position as the one against the other. So how do you retain institutionally, in knowledge, in imaginaries, a multiplicity and heterogeneity in which difference is not the problem that needs to be solved, whether through homogenizing or polarizing, but you retain it and institutionalize it. And I think that's a serious stake. Why is this brought back to IPS for me? Because it is an interesting stake for us. It's specifically sensitive for my generation, I think, or people at least, or people who come like me from a certain way of thinking around deconstruction and so on, which was partly exactly aimed at undoing this politics. It's based in the philosophical, theoretical, sociological traditions, which are very much arguing against emerging from the crisis of ideological politics and the strong binarization and bipolarization of politics, both in the world, in political spheres, in spheres of knowledge. And somehow the politics of knowledge today, there are trends going on where one tries to repolarize around two kinds of knowledges. And critique comes in there. That is, the critique, when you look at, as my colleagues, J.F. Droledos and Mike Williams in the project on the far right, the way the far right thinkers organize is against liberalism. A critique of the liberal order. The other side does the same. This is a classical way of organizing that's going on. And so you have a kind of homogenizing that is there. And so countering it, historically, just reinforces the structuration of the political field, but also the knowledge field in which you start taking position in these terms. And therefore, I do not agree that everything and the thinking about multiplicity, heterogeneity, and so on, and the fracturing of politics is the liberal kind of idea that expresses itself in, the 2020s now. I think the stake is there. And the politics of fracturing, decentering, transversality is partly a politics of retaining that. Now, if there's a re-ideolized, a rendition of ideological politics in binary terms, and this is a very tough stake to have, because of course you cannot position yourself in the same binary. So in the politics of knowledge, that is okay, because you start formulating different forms of concepts and so on that are there. But it's increasingly difficult to do and to sustain. And so that's my first trend. Got a bit more time, right, for the second one. So that's the first thing, the first stake, which is a stake within IPS in our little universe, little field, right? But I think it also resonates, it's homologous. It doesn't mean it's with what's going on more widely. And I think that's an important question to consider about how disarray is being organized in world politics, wherever this politics is based. The second one, I'll do the second one as well. I've got a bit time for it. The second trend, this brings, I want to start back for those of us who weren't there. Sorry about that. This morning we had a lecture by Inge on the planetary movements. How the problematique of the planetary, which arises from a problematique of environmental politics most explicitly, but how this institutes an imaginary of the planetary. Now, Engel did a lot of work on the planetary through social movements, how this is an imaginary, what's involved in that, it's not so clear cut. We worked through all these little bit of activist genealogies through which you can see different elements of the planetary emerge, so different conceptions, imaginaries emerge. One thing he didn't talk about is how the planetary, in a lot of that work, emerges from the understanding of an ending and a catastrophe that is taking place. This idea that why are we supposed to be concerned about the planetary is that the planetary imaginary, partly, not fully, because he gave all the genealogies, arises in the idea of a waning catastrophe, or a catastrophe we are already living actually very often. And so there is an element in which one organizes the disarray of world politics through the catastrophe, the ending, of species, of the ecosystem, of whatever that is there. And therefore there is a stake here, the stake that you find in Bruno Latour, which is about how do we think the catastrophe. So that's one way of engaging with how do you think catastrophic. What's involved in actually letting one of the key questions in world politics today, if we agree on that, about planetary politics, environmental politics, and how the planetary emerges, to let it emerge against the background or even through the instrument or the tool of catastrophe and ending, an ending of a time. This is high stakes. How do we engage with this without reinforcing, therefore, you have to take a position on this. And therefore we have again this idea, you have deniers and those in front. Those who are almost like blindly supporting. Now, what I liked about the planetary movements is of imaginary, is of course you have not necessarily this binary position. So it comes back to this idea where you can let the multiplicity of elements emerge. But there is also a second question I think we need to ask is, it is very tempting from critical analysis and critique to think in endings, catastrophes, as if life and histories are always defined in the wake of or in the vision of an ending, life unto death, history unto death, right? Unto its ending, and then maybe another history emerges or something like that. So you have these coming. Now I think that we need to think, this is a topic I can say, I can make normative claims here. Yes, I think we need to think more in terms of how things are continuously in motion, so that actually the planetary imaginary of Gaia is not about a whole, it's about all kinds of flows, earth flows, geological changes and motions, species motions, genetic kinds of things. Rethinking the relationship between an environment, this happens in epigenetics, cellular environments, proteins, but also between humans and nature and so on. So you have this multiplicity of movements and motion in terms of how we move in relation to one another, but not just as humans, but also, of course, motion in terms of time. Time is turbulent, right? Turbulent in the sense of it is not random, but it's not predictable either. So you actually move in that way and try to think then away from, if we think in terms of forces of difference and multiplicity, how they relate in relation to one another, constituting elements, which you cannot hold on to and say, this is the solution, then we might also have an approach that is more open to see what is that, how the planetary emerges as a different imaginary, but a different politics that is not embedded in the catastrophe, but in the possibilities and creative that are continuously created. Whether you do it to planetary movements, or whether you do it to activists, or whether you do it to what scientists are doing, or a combination of these things, what NGOs are doing, what international institutions are doing. Yeah, but this element about things being in motion and in relation and multiplicity, therefore you don't deal with the disarray again by solving the problem of difference and multiplicity and heterogeneity, by embedding it in a moment of catastrophe that calls upon you to take radically position, often opposing positions too, which is a quite specific way in which the planetary can emerge. And I would argue that we should not do that. It's a bit unsettling because, of course, if the stakes are so high as is continuously repeated, that, you know, ecological disaster is on the horizon or is already here, yeah, then of course it calls you for a necessity to take radical measures to deal with it. But maybe radical measures are much more about, again, institutionalizing the variety of elements and creativity of how you work with this without embedding it in a catastrophe to which you organize it. And that is, therefore, I think both these stakes are related. And that's the second stake, second problem, trend that I think is important to look at. And it's all about how we organize this area. Thank you.
Hello again. Yes, though this looks like my sort of topic, I'm enormous difficult figuring out how to respond. Some of what I'll say has already been said by Nicole and Jeff. I'll say a number of things very briefly. One is, for all the talk of rapidly changing forces, we still confront a very familiar problem: how to make sense of multitudes of phenomena within the inherited intellectual resources we have with us. There's too much to know, and it's an enormous problem trying to make sense of it all. So we pursue the usual route of working through disciplines, theorizations, cults, whatever. Entire ways of being, entire cultural formations. We get stuck in these things. So we have the familiar problem of being hostage to the categories we've inherited and the institutions which we produced as categories. It's a familiar problem. It's especially intense now, I presume, if it is especially intense now. That's a claim. I'm not entirely sure one can make it without thinking about it. Because the phenomena we are forced to confront are so clearly exceeding the prevailing intellectual resources we've got. This problem is compounded by the degree to which we are so attached, invested in, and even in love with the resources we deploy. We love the way we think, and we think that because we love the way we think, we can understand all the phenomena that are not there. But clearly, if it is indeed the case we're talking about disarray, the disarray applies to our ways of thinking quite as much as anything that we're thinking about. So in the first instance, I want to say that over and above all the usual warnings about the dangers of prediction, I would say that we confront a rather serious problem with our diagnostic capacities. How do we now judge? I said this time last week. How do we now judge what is most important? How do we think of relations between what is important? How should we now think about, especially, change of what and for who? And how clear are we about our common, even if tacit, assumption that we know what it was once like to live in stability, predictability, My old buddy Rick Ashley was very fond of the phrase, things ain't what they used to be, but they never were. And okay, so there's a demand for prediction, even clairvoyance, but what skills are now required? Here I can only give a very limited and personal account of what I tend to look for when trying to make sense of the current scene. You've heard it all before. This is why I'm a bit worried. So I've got 8 lines. Mirko stole one, Jeff stole another. That leaves me with 6, but I'll do the 8. Line, move 1. Expect the unexpected. It's a Machiavellian thing. Machiavelli was the master of thinking about contingency. And the usual story goes is that the Machiavellian Renaissance pagan notion of radical contingency, or at least the notion that one has to fight with the goddess, gradually gave way to the taming of chance. So you replace the goddess with a casino. And once you have the casino, you can make money out of the unexpected. That's more or less the root of our modern economic thinking. We have tamed chance. We timed it through the clock, as Mirko said. We timed it through all kinds of technologies. And Machiavelli had it easy. He just had to think contingency against eternity. Now we have to think contingency against all kinds of inherited concepts of time, timing, machinery, and I would say the spatialization of time, which makes us indeed incapable of thinking temporally, because we can only think of time as a concept, and as a concept it's already spatial. So one of the things I tend to think about in looking at the current scene is the way in which the news reports and academic analysis are so full of temporal tropes which underestimate the Machiavellian understanding of the moment, the radical contingency or the seductions of the moment. And we are too comfortable with our assumption that we can indeed predict. I think this speaks to a whole range of other big questions. Secondly, one of the big questions obviously is sovereignty. Sovereignty has not gone away. It's not going to go away. Maybe it was never there in the first place, you might want to say. We think generally in terms of one concept of sovereignty. All the stories about international relations pretend it was invented in the 17th century or something. No, it's a long story. It's basically theological in origin, and there are many versions of it, and some versions of sovereignties are radically different from the story we've got. We've got mainly a kind of sacrifice narrative. We give up things in order to get something else. We give up nature in order to get nurture. We give up a certain conception of human being in order to get a civilized human being. That's the sort of narrative we've got. And that's all framed in certain ways. I would say that one should be looking for other understandings of sovereignty, multiple variations of sovereignty, and the pluralization of them, and the relationship between them, and to think of sovereignty as movement and its practice and all kinds of other things. This has been said by many people. But nevertheless, the political imagination of the largely Old Testament story of sovereignty remains heavily imbued in our understanding of what order once looked like. And I would say here, the problem is not, there was not order. It's not that we can talk about the disorder by comparison with some established narrative about stability. But if we're talking about the international, if you're talking about sovereignties in that mode, then you're talking simultaneously about a pattern of order and disorder, in which disorder and order are mutually constituted. The international is precisely a deal. You can have your order as long as you put up with disorder. Disorder is the price. It's called war, for example, for your peace. But peace requires war. So even peace is a form of disorder. So the notion you can play philosophy of history of a move from order to disorder profoundly misidentifies what's at stake in thinking about an internationalized order. It's always both. The question is how far you can make certain kinds of order in certain places, under what conditions, for whom, et cetera, and the point at which that necessarily gives way as the condition under which the order can be preserved. War and peace, in that sense, are equally constituted around a certain set of limits. So the third move, you know this one too, boundaries. Boundaries are not going away either. And so how to think about boundaries? Well, I won't go into it too much, except they are proliferating, they're getting fatter, they look more like curves of distribution, they are sometimes attached to territoriality, they are sometimes abstract, sometimes concrete, sometimes they take the form of borders, sometimes they take the form of laws, sometimes they are simply invisible. We work on the assumption that they're all in the same place at the same time. It's clearly not the case. What happens when it's not the case? What happens when the borders start becoming sites of politics, not as markers of the difference between different polities? I would say you should think much more about borders, boundaries, and limits as the constituted practice which produces things on either side of them. It was always this way. We always pretended it was not this way. But I think fairly clearly now you're seeing all kinds of interesting politics which occur right in the middle of borders and boundaries and limits. So the whole narrative about the norm and the exception is a very limited one. It's always a set of relations. Out of that comes spatialities, obviously. We are presumably witnessing transformations in the organization of space. How you think that is not easy, but also temporalities, but also the relationship between spatialities and temporalities. If you try to think one or the other, it gets lost. So I myself find it much more interesting to read about historical geographies than I do about histories or geographies. It's the combination of historical geographies that seems to be really interesting. And I find it interesting to pretend that one can do a historical geography of the present without falling entirely into the control of the official categories of modern social science in general or international relations in particular. Next, maybe this is crucial. Where is the antagonism? Where are the antagonisms between claims to humanity and claims to political qualified citizens now being enacted? There aren't many obvious answers, not least involved movements of people, migrants, and the rest of it. There's all kinds of other things. That is the core antagonism set up once you insist with Machiavelli that the life of the man is more interesting than the life of the angels. If man is the center of all things, then which man, the general or the particular man? How do you set up the relation? The international system gives you your standard answer. As does the state, as does the notion of the modern subject. So we know that life is more complicated than the official story of the system expressing humanity, the state expressing the citizen, the individual, subject expressing both humanity and citizenship. Life is all over the map here. So how is that antagonism being played out? In particular, what patterns of inclusion and exclusion are emerging that doesn't quite fit into the conventional story of friends and enemies? Next, where are the conventions? This is Jeff's point. It's about the dualisms. Where it's so often the case that politics involves dividing the world into two, choosing one or the other, and having the other affirm the one. So I find this to be a complete pathology of modern politics, and it infuses the practices of all kinds of political actors, including social movements, progressive and reactionary. The dualism. So how to think about situations where those dualisms are refused? Those situations where one understands you've got mutually constitutive opposites which set up
a game of normal and abnormal, or presence and escape. That's the standard narrative, which is replayed in all kinds of situations, not least in relation to universal rationality and particularistic meaning. The Enlightenment versus the Romantics in the European tradition. We replay that over and over and over and over again in all kinds of contexts. I find it interesting to look for those sites in which that is resisted. There are many of them. The next question that follows is, how do you understand the potentials which arise once you understand that the dualistic response to these things really reproduces the dualism? And finally, I'm interested in trying to look at situations where the demands of the geo, call it the planet, if you want, are actually actively engaged in forms of politics which were constructed by more or less resisting the notion of the geo, the planet, whatever you want to call it. Because clearly, unless you are thinking very clearly about the implications, not only of climate change, but many, many other things involved with another now label ecology and the rest of it, then I don't see how one has very much to say about politics at this contemporary time. But, of course, it's historically very difficult to think environment politically, nature politically. It's the exclusion of nature, exclusion of the planet, the world, God, and to some degree other humans. Has been the condition under which you can talk about inclusion and exclusion in a particular political frame. So I look fairly closely at situations in which one is forced to reconstruct an understanding of political order, disorder, which is attentive to that geo and doesn't devolve into the kind of geopolitics on flat Earth that we're currently experiencing. This is simply to say there's a whole list for me. I'm not doing more or less the same thing as Jeff was doing, listing things that are interesting, points where I look. This is a biographical stuff. This is what I do, because I look at the news, I look at all these bits going on. I can't possibly take it for own value. So I find myself having to think through particular sites which might or might not suggest that something important is going on. For me, that is the question. What is going on that is important? What is most important? How does one judge these things? It used to be so clear. Now, to me, the problem is the most difficult thing. The answer is probably much easier. But actually formulating questions about what matters at this point and in what order strikes me as the most profound thing that one can deal with.
Thank you, Rob. Cool. Yes, thanks, guys. We're opening for questions. If you can address the world in disarray in some way.
Yeah, I think
Wait for the mic.
Thank you. It called my attention that I think none of you really mentioned like what makes the world in disarray right now. I think they mentioned that it's always been disarray, but something concrete, probably things that are concrete now. And I just don't want you to list, but like Rob was saying, some things probably you consider that are more important than others that make the world in disarray right now, and why. I mean, I just, it's just a comment that you spoke really theoretical about things, but I imagine that we all have like a picture of what is most important, or what is in disarray that worries us to make like a roundtable like this right now. I haven't heard about concrete examples or stories.
Thank you, Susanna. Anyone else? Jim?
Not sure who was the one who put together the theme, but disarray is an interesting term. It's not something you hear about in global politics in the same way you hear of order/disorder, organization versus disorganization. So it's more aesthetic somehow, but not suggesting certainly that anyone should talk about aesthetics in the usual way. But it's so I'm just commenting, I guess, curious about the term itself.
Thanks, Jimmy. Okay. Anyone?
Thanks, Susanna, but I think I did actually point out two things that concern me. One is the reinforcement of the binaries that you see emerging in various areas, right? And the position it calls upon you. This is an academic area where this works. For example, that you're called upon to take position, which I find get a lot now. What about the global south if you study Europe? What about race if you don't study about race? They call you into being, into positioning on the binary. They are in academia, but they're also politically happening in strong forms. They're organizing around. So that's how difference becomes rendered to representations that polarize. It's a concern I have around politics. So that's one. The other one is really how we let the environmental issues emerge through the planetary and what's involved in that, which is a concern about catastrophic thinking, organizing politics around questions of certain modes of insecurity, of what I call sometimes life unto death, whatever that comes to stand for metaphorically. I think these are quite specific issues at play. And of course, it's a list. It's like Rob said, we could probably choose another one if we wanted to. But these are two that I think are particularly important to engage with. They're also important for me to engage with from within IPS, right? Because both the planetary is an interesting imaginary in the discipline that structures itself around man, the state, the international, the global, right? How it cuts into that, and it cuts in very interesting ways into that if you read some of the literature. And the polarization, as I said, if difference becomes polarization, it reopens all the discussions around what is difference, not in relation to how one sets difference back into terms of identity rather than difference in relations to multiplicity and heterogeneities. And so you see this at play, that partly with the interest in authors like Anna Singh, John Law, Bruno Latour on the one hand on the assembly, which is a search for this multiplicity and heterogeneity, while on the other hand, you have a re-emerging of certain forms like geopolitical thought that comes in quite strongly, re-emerging of historical materialism that I see happening in some quarters in London at the moment. It's where I live. So that's where so you see these things emerging. And I think they're at stake at the moment. And it's much about disarray. Maybe I didn't come up with the term disarray, but I actually kind of like it, Jimmy, because in some way, we usually think order, disorder. But if we accept that there is nothing but disarray, that is the problem of heterogeneity, things and turbulence, right? Things are on the move all the time. Things are always turbulent. And that doesn't mean there are no densities and certain kind of patterns that take place, but it is an unpredictability if you're always in disarray. And if the disarray has no clear opposite, like world politics and disorder, let's look for the order. If disarray remains always that we can only be in disarray, then it becomes how do you organize the multiplicity, heterogeneity, and so it becomes a method of who is organizing the disarray, but they remain ontologically in disarray all the time, despite pretending that maybe they're not in disarray. pretending that there is a fixed kind of and try to move us back into order versus disorder. So I started liking the term when I started thinking about it. Anyone else?
Thank you. To the first question, I think this is probably a very unsatisfactory answer, and I'm sorry, but I think I want to resist the idea that that was one of the point of pointing out specific things, because we could easily do a less conceptual list than the one that Jeff just did and be like AI becoming probably constant, then climate change, then a list of wars everywhere in the world, poverty, whatever. I mentioned this, but one of the point I wanted to make is that it's the narrativization of it as being the problem of the present. That's what I think it's most interesting, like the meaning and the value associated with giving meaning, and which I think is usually done to call for actions, and possibly, as Jeff said, an action that ends up in a binary and in an antagonistic politics and structuration of the social, etc. So I'm okay if we want to like think about one of these things, but then I want to dispute the like ontological primacy of it, and instead think about the narrativization of it. As to disarray, I honestly, as every non-native English speaker, went to Oxford Dictionary as soon as I saw the name of the round table. I was like, okay, I know what it means, but what's the definition? And I think, if I'm not wrong, don't quote me on this, that it says a state of disorganization and untidiness. I thought the untidiness bit was interesting, but then I left it out because it was like, okay, it's too difficult. But I'm not sure I agree, Jeff, that it does better on leaving the heterogeneity there, because you still have an opposite, right? You do have array as opposed to disarray, but yeah, I don't know. I think the aesthetical thing, it's interesting because it speaks to some like affective dimension of it, possibly. That is interesting. Okay, sorry.
Disarray. It's the state of my office. I like it's a nice term because it's an attempt to avoid even worse terms. And so I think it's a term that actually advertises its uselessness, because we don't want to use these strong terms or anarchy, etc., etc. So it's a gesture, it's an avoidance, and I think gestures of avoidance are sometimes necessary. Moreover, disarray in my office I find very creative, because I can't find things and I find other things instead. And it's very helpful. The disarray is good. Concrete examples. I started off by insisting we've got the same problem all the time. We've got, I call them phenomena, because that's the epistemological version. You could call it experience, particularities, actually existing lives, empiricals, and we live in a cultural, I mean we live in a world in which we learned to deal with that. We live under generalizations, universal nouns, which do violence to the specific. That's what they live. And this goes very deep. And we're still how we do it. So some people prefer to attend to the phenomena very closely. Some people try to make sense of how the phenomena are connected and whatever. It's an unsolvable dilemma, theorization, experience. I'm sure it can be done differently. My own view is that in the end, the experience matters. in the end, my heart is with the empiricists, actually. Well, it's not what I'm good at. And so, again, it's a biographical thing. I can't do the empirical. I'm not a phenomenologist. And nor are many other people. And yet, in order to get control over the larger pattern in which people's lives are matter, one has to resort to these generalizations. Always a politics to generalizations. Those generalizations, those abstractions, do a hell of a lot of damage. So it's not that I like being theorist, but I think they are a place where a lot of really nasty politics happens, and it seems so anodyne. It's not the concrete that kills you all the time, it's the abstraction that kills you, much more effective, which is why I attend to it.
I came up with the disarray title. I confess. And I can't really remember if it was just because I was desperate to get the title done before the brochure for the IPS Winter School went went public, or it was a reference to some title of some book. Maybe Rob doesn't.
I think there is a book, but I can't remember what it is.
Yeah, exactly. It's from that time, I think, from the 1980s. I can't remember. Anyway, but I think maybe 2 points I want to make. The first is that I do feel the world is in disarray. And I think it's, on the one hand, a good thing because chaos or disarray, if you like, makes us think and try to think about not what's going on, but think in terms of facing that what we cannot make sense of. And these are important moments, right? They can be very depressive, very melancholic. It can paralyze you, and often it does paralyze you. Because I come from a time when, there was a lot of disarray, but there was a lot of to look forward to. Like the time as an organizing device, analytical device. Because I remember seeing the end of the military regime in Brazil, the passing of the amnesty law here, the first democratic election. These were all very turbulent times, but there was something to look forward to. So it was a kind of disorganization that at the same time allowed us to see how we could put things back together. Both in terms of what was meaningful, but also in terms of how to organize time. I remember seeing the end of the Cold War, the fall of the Berlin Wall. I was actually in Italy at that time. The first Gulf War, also, and the last Congress of the Communist Party of Italy, the PUC, I also saw that. So, what were these things? It was the emergence of the new, the eruption, if you like, of the new, very disorganized stuff. Nobody knew what's going to happen. But there was room in this sudden void, right, between the death of the old and the emergence and the birth of the new, like Gramsci used to say. This void, which was not void, right, was full of meaning, full of sense, determined that, yeah, sure, we had something to look for. And there was a historical sense too, that it was the end of an era, but the beginning of another. These days, I'm not so sure. And to be concrete, as Susanna wants us to be, I think there's a real crisis of a lot of things that structured world politics in the past 30 or 40 years. Democratic politics is in crisis. We don't know exactly what's going to happen to it. The relationship between capitalism and institutions of representation also, you don't need democracy to manage capitalism anymore. You can do that under the Chinese model. You can do it, through oligarchs and other stuff, like in Russia. So the notion we had 30 years ago that, well, despite everything, if you have capitalism as the only mode of production, as the only historical social formation in the world, somehow contradictions would lead to some kind of democratization. That's not there anymore. That means also that certain institutions after 45 that managed world order don't have any function anymore. Right? So the notion that the model of democratic institutions are a template to organize world politics is not there anymore either. So it's not anymore about representing the third world, right? Multilateralism, democratizing global governance institutions. You know, that's not a necessity yet. The only necessity there is to think. And we think before a world in disarray, before chaos. That's my feeling. Sorry, this is very absorbing. I really didn't intend to speak at all. But I have this sense that I'm in a constant state of perplexity. I can't really get my head around this. This is bad, but at the same time, it's necessary if you want to think at all. So sorry about the disarray, but that's really how I feel. Questions there?
So thank you for this very inspiring talk. I think you, in the beginning, all mentioned that how the world is all when it hasn't been great. But I was thinking, there are so many ways of interpreting this array, and I was wondering about the role of repetition, because I feel like there's a way of seeing the disarray that we might be facing now, as if like we have seen this before, you know, it's, and it comes a lot with like the decades we are in the century, and like looking at the previous century, trying to identify the same elements and kind of like trying to predict what's going next. So like some people say World War and so on, and that's where we're heading, you know. So my question is more about how you see this idea of repetition in the way that we look, or like people interpret this disarray.
Thank you also for the very inspiring talk. My question is regarding temporality and catastrophe, because I was thinking one thing that people at the Future Center at Hawaii always say something very similar to what Mirko was saying about how the future don't actually exist, but images of the future affect the present and like a political effect of the present. And I was thinking about this catastrophe to come that Jeff was talking about as this one image of this totalizing ending that affects the politics, the planetary politics we have in the present. But at the same time, I keep wondering also about how to take seriously the environmental violence and extinction events and all these multiple endings of forms of life that are occurring. So I was wondering how to think, if you're thinking this in terms of like multiple catastrophes, or to get rid totally of the catastrophic thought, and yeah, how to engage this kind of violence and extinctions with the thought of multiple temporalities. Also the affective dimension that Mirko was talking about, how does the affective dimension of thinking of this violence is affecting also the temporary.
Thank you. All panelists as well. I'm a bit torn because I'm ambivalent, disarrayed, I guess, in relation to Jeff's talk. So maybe I want to share my disarray with you, Jeff, and see if you can, not array it apparently, but so here's the reason. There's two versions of it. So the first one is the way you've pointed to by polarization as a question nowadays and how against it or as an alternative we should think about withholding heterogeneity. And I'm thinking about the way in which some movements nowadays or some theorists are arguing that heterogeneity or disarray is actually one of the ways in which new political movements such as the far right actually operates. So there is a binarization there, but it's also because there's ambivalence and heterogeneity that it actually works. And so on the one hand, it makes sense to me to just say polarization is a problem and we should respond to it, but it also seems that some versions of heterogeneity and ambivalence and both and logics, to use a term that Cynthia Weber used to make such analysis, are actually also part of the way in which things are happening these days, not just binarization. So that's one, back and forth in relation to what you're saying. The other is there's two dimensions, again, binarization and catastrophism, and I'm just thinking about the international. So this big concept of the international and how it is organized on the one hand on the binarization of friend and enemy, but through this binarization, it produces heterogeneity, the possibility of having difference organized in a very specific way, not any kind of heterogeneity, but heterogeneity and difference is actually there. And at the same time, one of the things that the international is organized against is precisely the coming of the end of the days, right? So, the coming of return of politics, like the return of Christ and the end of days, and those millennialism.
Apocalypse.
Yeah, apocalypse. Yeah. Thank you. And so it seems like the international is actually a very good way of responding to exactly the two things you're saying are problems nowadays. And I'm quite sure this is not where your band is going. So if there's, if you could help me disarray this some more, that would be helpful. Can I get one more there? Or? Sure. Yeah. Okay. So, and that's my quick question to Mirko. So I've tried to deal with it and I'll try to cut it. So I like the idea of time as timing and the way in which you think about it as a processual way. And I'm thinking this is actually a way we can think about any concept. If you think of it as processual, then it becomes a tool for analytics and a tool for critique. So what is at stake of doing it specifically with time? In general, or specifically now? We could do it with so many other terms. Thank you.
Very good. Thanks, guys. I think now we can give the mic back to our panelists. Who wants to go first? You? Great, great. The young always.
I'm hoping that I can steal other people's points again, so that they are in disarray, and I'm not. So thanks to this. Where do I start? Okay. I think I want to tackle Adriana's and Renata's question perhaps together, because. So how do I see repetition in interpretation of these arrays? My one way I would intuitively, that is, without having thought really carefully about this, I might repent this, but one way that I would intuitively think about this is the idea of affective familiarization. So that's why I think that speaks to Adriana's point as well. There's something to rhythms and repetition that we're familiar with, and it gives the idea of familiarization. So just thinking, even when it's, you know, it's a bad thing, even when you think there's going to be another war or whatever, you still feel like you know what's going to happen, and that is one way to seek the ordering, right? And that's why narratives, which organize this kind of cyclical or repetitive, rhythmic way, I think are pretty effective and successful. Which then, for me, is sort of an answer to Adriana's question, because I think the obsession with catastrophic thought is precisely because it gives the idea of the end as an answer, and it calls for action because it mobilizes affects and it kind of tells you, you know, we need to do it and do it now, because otherwise it ends. But we might want to meet the possibility that it doesn't, you know, and I'm not trying to be anti-scientist here or a negationist of climate change. I'm just trying to, you know, politically it works and it makes sense to, like, you know, polarize and do that move, but you might want to meet the possibility that it isn't the only alternative in order to take it seriously. I'm going to do the last one and then I'll shut up. So what is the sake of doing what I do specifically with time as opposed to other concepts? Yeah, I don't have a good answer to that, I'm afraid. I have an answer to that though, and that is that time is so intuitive and hyper pervasive that everybody sees it in a way that maybe other concepts you don't. That said, I kind of apply this to conceptual analysis in my own work, so it's a bit, but yeah, I think that the very fact that time is everywhere all the time, sorry for the not intended pun, kind of is precisely one of the reasons why we should do it with time. Doesn't mean we shouldn't do it with anything else. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael.
It'll make it easier for you. I've got these words written down on this sheet here from these questions. I'm thinking repetition, and as I raised the question of repetition, I'm not quite sure what's the stake in the question. Then over here I've got heterogeneity, and I start looking at it, and what emerges is the name to those. Are you thinking repetition in that sense? And is Jeff thinking heterogeneity as a kind of Deleuzian solution to the binary? I mean, I'm going to assume that that's what's going on. So in the latter case, I guess I'm feeling sympathetic to Paulinho's question about the adequacy of the notion of heterogeneity. Because as many of you know, I think Gibbon has failed. He may have been an interesting ontologist, but as a political thinker, I think he failed. But he did have some interesting things to say. Heterogeneity notion is part of what in his texts he lays out precisely the binary. It's part of the way he's thinking about the lines of flight. But actually, he said much more about the apparatus of capture. I think the apparatus of capture always goes missing when people do Deleuze as the ontologist and think they're doing politics. And if you're doing international relations, that stuff. The apparatus of capture can't be forgotten. Now, heterogeneity, I don't think it actually gets away from the one main program at all. because the hetero, well, you could say it goes on to infinity. But as soon as you say it goes on to infinity, you've got a boundary. Because you can never get to infinity. So if you're playing Deleuzean tropes here, methodologically, I like the idea of heterogeneity, but actually, conceptually, I don't. I don't know what it is in this place. The repetition, Deleuze puts it in conjunction with identity. It's his greatest book, brilliant book, Identity and Repetition. But I don't know what to do with it, so I don't quite know what you're getting here. One could say the repetition is a practice. It's the repetition, it simply reproduces. It's not unlike its political effect. It's not unlike the effect you might attribute to stories about mimesis, imitation, or even to cycles, the eternal returns. There's something going on there. And that's, of course, got to do with the long history of how we develop concepts of time temporality. The third word I've got down on my piece of paper here is catastrophe, which then, in brackets, apocalypse, which of course, okay, is theology. And I never use the word catastrophe. I never use the word apocalypse, just as I never try to use the word origin, because they're the same thing. They're the same story told on both ends. So if we're talking here about the dangers of apocalyptic narrative, trying to capture the multiple instances of stuff going on out there, it seems to me that one has to both beware of the eschatological theologies which are generating an apocalyptic story, but also the similarly Christian foundation myths of origin, which make those apocalyptic stories possible. It seemed to me, I didn't say this, but it's more or less everything I say. If you think you can do anything different without getting rid of the double act of the foundation myth of the story of limits it produces, the origin and the apocalypse, profoundly Christian stuff, if you think you can get away, produce some other narrative without getting rid of those, well, good luck, is what I say. So that somehow or another, I'm not being very articulate, but somehow or another, there is something going on between these three words I got on this paper. And I'm not sure what I've said answers to the questions that were talked about. So for a real answer,
I should not have given this first to you. I'm not a real answer at all. But I also disagree on, Deleuze is not a philosophical thinker, but I do think there are some interesting stakes that are articulated. But can I, Adriana, why do you want, if you're interested in the violence and the specific extinctions that take place, want to analytically aggregate them into a catastrophe or multiple catastrophes? Because the catastrophe, as Rob says, brings in a quite specific way of thinking them. Is it not sufficient to think, if you're interested in violences, right, to think the violences or specific violences, and you don't aggregate them, but put them next to one another, without aggregating them under the term catastrophe, which is my problem. What is happening when you aggregate them under catastrophe as a way of thinking the violences that are going on? And I think that's one of the stakes that's present at the moment. If you go to Latour's book, Facing Gaia, he deals with catastrophe, but it is within the political theology, it's in the section where he does religion in relation to nature, right? So that shows, once you lock yourself into that, this is a kind of way of both analytically but also politically of rendering violences, individual extinctions. But I agree, every time when I see in the newspaper, so many species are being extinct, it becomes seen as if we are actually often linked to this thing. Oh, and that has all kinds of ripple effects and consequences, which mean therefore a catastrophe in the making for everything. Right? So I can see the temptation, but I'm wondering why you would do it that way. On the repetition, there's two things, I think. One is it is indeed what you mean by repetition. Is repetition the reproduction of the same, right? Or is repetition therefore the reproduction? Then I think there are more interesting terms of repetition. So the Deleuzian one is an argument against identity. It's repetition, difference. And how do we think difference without falling back as the other of identity? Yeah, and so that notion of repetition is worth working with if you're interested in thinking. There's another moment, another bit where a discussion was going on, which is a discussion about the old and the new all the time. We can think about this in abstract terms, but there was a project that Rabinov was doing in anthropology, which was called Anthropology of the Contemporary, which was an attempt to find methodologically and conceptually ways of thinking where the new is always the old, but also new. So hence the contemporary. And so to get away from this idea, we have either reproduction of the same, but I don't know whether that covers repetition for you. Or we have break where, now biotechnology, he was studying biotechnology, I think, and the production of it. Is we are in a new era, or we have a completely new situation. And what there were interesting in the work is, what I found interesting is, of course, the term contemporary, but also how they try to think that methodologically, how you go about understanding and writing about these things and observing them. So I think the question of repetition is a very interesting one. And but I think what's going on? There are concepts of repetition which do not require reproduction of the same, right? That's partly also where notions of ephemeral kind of issues and so on come in. But I think the Deleuzian source, repetition and difference, makes an important move in how sometimes repetition is taught in relation to identity. And that's a big stake, I think. That's also a political stake. Whether you can have a politics through the difference without identity, that's of course the political question that arises. And that's a difficult one to deal with. Or maybe not, but I think it probably is. At least the way I've been trained, it's a difficult one to deal with. That brings me back to Lino's question on heterogeneity and binarity, and that the far right, for example, functions through heterogeneity. But to some extent, I'm going to have to make a difference here, because the question on the one hand is about analytical categories of how you understand, for example, a phenomenon like the far right, right? Whether you unify them and read them unifyingly back into the social processes through which it is being constituted or constitutes itself. And then, of course, you can actually get an element through reading it through the heterogeneity, which is also a semi-critical analysis, is actually a critical, quasi-critical analysis of it, if the politics works through the representation of unity. So then analytically, you actually are showing it works through heterogeneity. That doesn't solve then the problem about unification. There, I think, I don't know how to deal with it, but I need them to narrow down, and we have to think, how does the far right emerge in, for example, specific fields of practice, like a political field? And does it emerge and present itself? Does it try to structure the political field in a strong binarism? And what's happening? Is that the only way we can structure the political field? By actually engaging in these strong binarisms through which you do. If we agree that that's not the case, that always has to be, it doesn't have to be a single friend enemy distinction to structure the political field. Then, of course, it makes a difference politically as the political strategy of unification that you binarize or dualize the political field between us, whoever this us is, and the others party. And the rest is squeezed out, or is the wishy-washy, that kind of thing that, they don't really do politics at all. And that's the question of the institutionalization and the structuration of, for example, the political field in that case. And then heterogeneity might not be the right term. There are terms like other ones that I don't want to use pluralism, because pluralism is a tainted element for although I think it's not bad. All these work on pluralism is actually tries to take it in different directions. So there are terms for that, but they are a difference. But then it's located, right? That doesn't mean that these movements that you try to structure the political field around the binary themselves emerge and exist in a binary, so they can exist through the heterogeneity. That's how I would deal with it. And therefore, the political stake of heterogeneity is is both the analytical one to deconstruct within a political field that tries to binarize itself. Yeah, as a move in that. On the international, I do not agree that the international is friend enemy only. I mean, even Wendt has this touch of the three cultures of anarchy, right? I think the friend enemy structuration of politics is a very specific one. Right? That is the argument that you find, for example, in Engen Eissen's book on being political. But he looked at citizenship, right? As you have kind of differences that are going on, but the moment when you move to the friend enemy, you're out. I mean, you're out of the political for him. That's why it's an anti-Schmittian, right? So there are different positions in that. Therefore, doing the international as the friend enemy, we should know that is not the only way the international is done. The multilateralism, for example, is not the friend enemy distinction, right? In that way, at least I wouldn't see it like that. And definitely, I wouldn't structure politics around friend enemies as necessarily like that. For me, that's an anti-political move. I know that there are all kinds of arguments to say that this is highly political. I agree, but you know, from the position where I come, it would be to politics or anti-politics instead. Did I cover everything more or less? I think I did, more or less. And I don't like disarray anymore. On the topic.
Very briefly. I, on the other hand, do think identity is constitutional, so it's a big difference for things. But it's not my point. Because we've been talking about apocalypse, catastrophe, and basically theological stuff here, which is why it is for now, because of secularization of both Greek and Christian traditions. And it's a response to a religious problem, actually. You might think not so much a friend and enemy, but saved and damned. One of the possible, should we say, dynamics that might be identifiable precisely in a transition discourse from friend enemy, which is bad enough, to saved and damned, which is worse. Just a thought.
That does not mean there are no other terms within politics. So you don't have to have a choice between saved and damned and friend and enemy.
Oh, here's a big box of possible terms. The ones that always rise to the surface for some reason or another are those sorts of things.
I know, that's why we need to resist them. Anyway,
Kind of shocking.
Thanks, guys. Any more questions? Oh, not necessarily questions, statements or provocations. Provocations are good.
Thank you.
Nothing? So since you guys are tired and want to leave, is that it? Yes?
I'm happy.
You're happy with it?
Drinks.
Drinks. Okay, good. Thanks so much to our panelists. Please, an applause for everyone. Thanks to you for being here. Being so friendly to our winter school. Thank you very much. See you tomorrow for those who are in winter school, and those who are not, see you sometime. Yeah, hopefully.